Hebrews 12:1 states, "Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus." Ultimately, it took me 5 years to become Miss Ohio. But personally, I believe those 5 years were some of the most intense training for the ultimate race that I would have to run, beginning on June 17th, 2017. And that race is what I consider becoming Miss Ohio. From the moment that the crown went on my head, I began a full-out sprint, a sprint that would ultimately lead me here almost to the finish line. The race itself was one of the hardest that I've ever had to run in my life, but it was worth the effort and the time and the 5 years of training because it developed a perseverance that I would need, the perseverance to wake up at 2 a.m. Because most people see the pageant, they see what's on the stage, they see what's on TV at Miss America, but what they don't see is the behind the scenes. They don't see what goes into ultimately being Miss Ohio. The 2 a.m. wake-up calls, the long hours, the long driving. I was somewhat prepared for that aspect. But until you are fully running the race, going towards your dreams, giving it everything that you've got every single day, I'm thankful for the 5 years of training that it took leading up to that moment. It was some of the hardest 5 years of my life because I faced challenges and trials that I never expected to face. I think it's worth mentioning my history and my story because our stories are what shape us into becoming powerful speakers, powerful leaders, and ultimately that's what defines our legacy as Miss Ohio, is our story. I grew up in Louisville, Ohio, and grew up as a competitive gymnast. For 13 years, I devoted my entire life to this sport until the day that my world came crashing to a halt. The day that the doctors told me I was never going to be able to do gymnastics again because of the spinal injuries that I sustained. Now to some, I lost a sport, and it wasn't a big deal. But for me, it was the end of my identity. It was the end of what I perceived to be my purpose for living. And while that seems extreme, it was something that I devoted my entire childhood to. So when I was no longer the gymnast, I was lost, not understanding who I was, because when people asked who Sarah Clapper was, the first thing out of my mouth was, well, I'm a gymnast. So I had to do a lot of searching, and it was the most difficult years of depression and anxiety, contemplating whether or not my life was actually worth living. Now through those trials, I was able to develop this story that would be able to be told to students all across the state as Miss Ohio. And that's ultimately why I wanted to become Miss Ohio. And I didn't know that when I first started this race. I simply wanted to be Miss Ohio because of the scholarships that you would obtain through competing in the Miss America organization. But after a couple years, I realized that this story was something that students and even adults needed to hear. Because while it might not be gymnastics, a lot of times we allow who we are to be defined by what we do in life. Because when we allow what we do to define who we are, that's when we face challenges. That's when we face troubles that we might never be able to overcome. So that's what I did as Miss Ohio. Because of incredible sponsorships through Hempy Water and Jeff Nedler, I was able to travel to over 60 schools in Northwest Ohio alone, spreading a message of knowing who you are is someone that is so great, so valuable beyond measure, because it's someone who is able to make a difference and impact the lives of people. It's not because of whether or not we succeed academically or whether or not we're the best football star. It's because at the end of the day, if we can base our value on something that is infinite, on something that we can understand as being our true value, then I believe that that will inspire hope in students that might not have hope. And that's what the job of Miss Ohio truly is. It's giving yourself 100% every single time you put on the crown and sash, making yourself vulnerable, allowing people to see your challenges and your struggles and your trials, because that's what allows you to be able to connect with students and adults, allowing them to see that Miss Ohio isn't a beauty pageant. It's not something that a lot of girls do just for the fame and the fortune, because believe me, if that's why you're competing in Miss Ohio, then you have the wrong notion of what it truly means to be Miss Ohio. It's a year of service, of serving the communities, of serving the people, but most importantly, it's serving the students and making sure that when they see Miss Ohio, they see hope and they see a light and they see in them something that is far greater than any activity or anything that they might do with their life. When I started this race, I wanted to run full out 365 days because I knew that this was a message worth sharing. And while it might not be glamorous all the time, with early wake-up calls, it was the race that I wanted to leave as my legacy. And now I can only hope and pray that there were students along the way that I passed in this race and I was able to bring them along with me. And that's truthfully what it ultimately means to be Miss Ohio.